Big Four, IPO, and Capital Markets Advisory. Interview Preparation. Part 1, Questions 1 to 25. Welcome back to the channel. Today we're diving into IPO and Capital Markets Advisory, one of the most structured and high-pressure areas in Big Four advisory. This topic often appears in interviews because it tests your understanding of regulation, reporting, governance, valuation, investor expectations, and cross-functional coordination. Let's begin. End on. How do you assess IPO readiness for a company planning to list within the next 12 to 18 months? Sample answer. I begin with an IPO readiness diagnostic across financial reporting, governance, internal controls, legal compliance, and investor story alignment. I evaluate gaps against SEBI ICDR norms, listing requirements, and typical public market expectations. I score readiness and build a remediation roadmap. While answering, always talk about regulatory gaps, governance maturity, financial reporting quality, and readiness roadmap. A company wants to move from private to public governance standards. How do you evaluate the gaps? Sample answer. I compare current governance practices with public company requirements, independent directors, audit committees, related party oversight, board charters, internal controls, and disclosure standards. I highlight gaps and prioritize them by regulatory urgency. While answering, always talk about governance benchmarking, board structure, control expectations, and remediation priorities. How do you determine the appropriate listing exchange, NSE/BSE versus overseas listing? Sample answer. I assess size, sector, liquidity needs, investor base, valuation multiples, compliance complexity, and brand aspirations. I also compare eligibility requirements and disclosure obligations across exchanges. While answering, always talk about liquidity, valuation, regulatory burden, and investor reach. A company has inconsistent financial reporting. How do you prepare it for IPO quality financials? Sample answer. I standardize accounting policies, improve close processes, review historical adjustments, and enforce robust documentation. I also enhance disclosures so financials withstand public and regulatory scrutiny. While answering, always talk about policy alignment, data consistency, documentation discipline, and audit readiness. How do you evaluate whether the company needs restatement of historical financial statements for IPO? Sample answer. I analyze accounting policy changes, error corrections, carve-outs, discontinued operations, and material misstatements. If past reporting wouldn't meet IPO standards, restatement is required. While answering, always talk about materiality, technical compliance, historical integrity, and investor impact. A promoter group has complex shareholding. How do you simplify the structure before IPO? Sample answer. I evaluate cross-holdings, preference shares, trusts, intercompany investments, and non-operating entities. I design a simplified, transparent structure aligned with listing norms. While answering, always talk about transparency, regulatory compliance, tax impact, and investor confidence. How do you review the DRHP for accuracy, completeness, and regulatory compliance? Sample answer. I cross-check numbers with audited financials. Validate disclosures against SEBI ICDR requirements. And ensure all risk factors, contracts, related party transactions, and governance details are complete. While answering, always talk about disclosure accuracy, regulatory mapping, consistency checks, and completeness. A company has multiple related party transactions. How do you assess their impact on IPO disclosure? Sample answer. I classify RPTs as material or non-material. evaluate economic substance, and assess whether they indicate dependency risks. I ensure transparent disclosure in DRHP and propose governance improvements. While answering, always talk about materiality, dependency risk, disclosure clarity, and governance safeguards. How do you coordinate between legal, bankers, auditors, and company management during the IPO process? Sample answer. I establish a governance structure, weekly working groups, clear owners for each work stream, timeline tracking, and issue escalation pathways. Coordination is key to keeping the DRHP and financials aligned. While answering, always talk about workstream governance, timelines, cross-functional alignment, and escalation. How do you help a client determine the appropriate offer structure, fresh issue versus OFS? Sample answer. I analyze capital needs, debt repayment, shareholder exit requirements, dilution impact, and investor sentiment. Fresh issue raises capital. OFS enables promoter PE monetization. While answering, always talk about capital needs, dilution modeling, exit objectives, and investor optics. A company wants to position itself as a high-growth tech business. How do you evaluate this narrative? Sample answer. I test revenue model scalability, unit economics, customer acquisition efficiency, retention metrics, and R&D investment. The narrative must be data-backed, not aspirational. While answering, always talk about growth metrics, unit economics, scalability proof, and narrative credibility. How do you review management forecasts for IPO valuation purposes? Sample answer. I test assumptions, compare growth with historical performance, run sensitivities, and validate with industry benchmarks. Overly optimistic projections can distort valuation. While answering, always talk about assumption testing, benchmarking, scenario analysis, and forecast discipline. A promoter wants to retain majority control post-listing. How do you model dilution scenarios? Sample answer. I analyze pre- and post-issue shareholding, ESOP pool adjustments, OFS impacts, and regulatory minimum public shareholding. I prepare dilution matrices for different issue sizes. While answering, always talk about shareholding math, regulatory limits, dilution modeling, and control preservation. How do you determine peer comparables for IPO valuation benchmarking? Sample answer. I select peers based on sector, business model, revenue scale, geography, and margin profile. I compare EV revenue, EV EBITDA, PE, and growth-adjusted multiples. While answering, always talk about comparability criteria, valuation multiples, scale adjustments, and defensibility. How do you analyze institutional investor sentiment ahead of a proposed IPO? Sample answer. I review recent IPO performance, sector fund flows, analyst commentary, and macro factors. I also speak with bankers to gauge investor appetite. While answering, always talk about market sentiment, sector appetite, macro signals, and investor behavior. A company has regulatory non-compliances. How do you help them resolve issues before filing DRHP? Sample answer. I categorize non-compliances, financial, operational, tax, secretarial, and work with legal teams to close outstanding matters. Transparent disclosure is mandatory. While answering, always talk about issue remediation, legal coordination, disclosure obligations, and timeline sensitivity. How do you assess business and operational risks that need to be disclosed under IPO risk factors? Sample answer. I analyze concentration risks, supply chain exposure, regulatory dependencies, margin volatility, and technology reliance. Risk factors must be specific, not boilerplate. While answering, always talk about business drivers, materiality, disclosure clarity, and investor transparency. A company plans to use IPO proceeds for capex. How do you validate reasonableness of use of funds? Sample answer. I validate project viability, capex budgets, ROI expectations, implementation timelines, and historical execution capability. While answering, always talk about project economics, ROI, execution capability, and investor justification. How do you review corporate governance requirements such as board composition and independent directors? Sample answer. I assess board independence, skills mix, diversity norms, committee structures, and director eligibility. IPO requires strict governance adherence. While answering, always talk about board composition, independence, committee structure, and regulatory fit. A company lacks internal controls maturity. How do you design IPO control remediation plans? Sample answer. I assess gaps in financial close, revenue processes, access controls, and documentation. I design a SOX-style internal controls roadmap before listing. While answering, always talk about control gaps, process remediation, testing plans, and IPO expectations. How do you review material contracts and agreements for IPO disclosures? Sample answer. I examine revenue concentration, dependencies, termination rights, pricing risks, and liabilities. Material contracts must be summarized clearly in the DRHP. While answering, always talk about dependencies, risk exposure, legal terms, and disclosure completeness. A client's revenue is highly concentrated. How do you evaluate its IPO readiness? Sample answer. I analyze top customer reliance, renewal history, churn risks, and margin sensitivity. Concentration must be transparently disclosed and mitigated. While answering, always talk about concentration metrics, renewal risks, mitigation, and investor messaging. How do you analyze promoter background and potential reputational risks? Sample answer. I conduct background checks, litigation reviews, media scans, and regulatory history evaluations. Reputational red flags can derail an IPO. While answering, always talk about background checks, litigation risk, media signals, and investor perception. A company wants to list overseas. How do you evaluate compliance with SEC Form F1 or foreign norms? Sample answer. I review IFRS US GAAP requirements, SEC disclosure rules, PCAOB audit expectations, and governance standards. Costs and complexity rise significantly. While answering, always talk about accounting standards, regulatory filings, audit requirements, and cost impact. How do you test reliability of segment reporting for IPO disclosures? Sample answer. I validate segment identification, allocation methods, revenue cost attributions, and consistency with internal reporting. Segment accuracy is critical for investors. While answering, always talk about segment logic, allocation accuracy, disclosure consistency, and audit readiness. How do you review financial statement line items for KPI consistency across periods? Sample answer. I reconcile KPIs with audited numbers, check definitions, and ensure consistency across years, so investors can compare performance clearly. While answering, always talk about definitions, reconciliation, consistency, and audit traceability. A company has negative cash flows. How do you justify equity story in the IPO narrative? Sample answer. I focus on growth trajectory, improving unit economics, operating leverage, and long-term profitability path, provided evidence supports the story. While answering, always talk about growth logic, unit economics, future visibility, and investor communication. How do you evaluate capital market conditions to determine ideal IPO timing? Sample answer. I assess volatility indexes, sector sentiment, liquidity trends, and recent IPO performance. Timing can materially impact valuation and subscription. While answering, always talk about volatility, liquidity, sector appetite, and timing sensitivity. A private equity investor wants partial exit during IPO. How do you manage conflicting interests? Sample answer. I balance valuation expectations, promoter control needs, and PE exit objectives. I structure OFS allocations aligned with investor appetite. While answering, always talk about stakeholder priorities, dilution math, exit strategy, and negotiation balance. How do you analyze whether ESOP pool needs to be expanded before IPO? Sample answer. I benchmark peer ESOP levels, assess hiring plans, and calculate dilution. ESOPs support retention and post-IPO performance. While answering, always talk about benchmarking, dilution modeling, talent strategy, and investor impact. A company needs to adopt Ind AS for IPO. How do you support the conversion process? Sample answer. I identify GAAP differences, perform impact assessments, restate historicals, and update accounting policies and disclosures. While answering, always talk about GAAP gaps, restatement, policy alignment, and audit readiness. How do you evaluate factors that may lead to IPO pricing overvaluation or undervaluation? Sample answer. I evaluate growth assumptions, peer multiples, market sentiment, and supply-demand dynamics during book building. While answering, always talk about assumptions, market sentiment, demand signals, and pricing risks. A business plans a SPAC merger instead of traditional IPO. How do you compare options? Sample answer. I compare speed, valuation flexibility, regulatory burden, dilution, and investor scrutiny. SPACs reduce IPO friction but increase dilution. While answering, always talk about speed, dilution, regulatory intensity, and investor perception. How do you support management during QIB meetings? Sample answer. I prepare messaging, refine storyline, train management on investor questions, and ensure numbers presented match disclosures. While answering, always talk about messaging, consistency, investor expectations, and confidence building. A company wants to highlight ESG credentials in its IPO. How do you validate claims? Sample answer. I review ESG metrics, certifications, audits, and sustainability initiatives. Greenwashing risks must be avoided. While answering, always talk about verification, measurable metrics, compliance, and investor trust. How do you review promoter lock-in requirements under SEBI ICDR regulations? Sample answer. I check pre-issue shareholding, promoter category classification, and lock-in timelines for regulatory compliance. While answering, always talk about regulation mapping, promoter classification, timelines, and disclosure. A group company has pending litigations. How do you evaluate disclosure requirements? Sample answer. I categorize litigations by materiality, financial impact, probability, and regulatory significance. I ensure appropriate DRHP disclosure. While answering, always talk about materiality, risk classification, financial exposure, and transparency. How do you analyze working capital dependencies and highlight them in offer documents? Sample answer. I review receivable cycles, payable terms, inventory levels, and seasonality. Investors expect clarity on cash conversion challenges. While answering, always talk about cash cycles, liquidity impact, seasonality, and disclosure. A company uses non-GAAP adjusted metrics. How do you validate and align them with IPO rules? Sample answer. I test calculation logic, reconcile to audited numbers, and ensure they aren't misleading. SEBI requires clear definitions and consistency. While answering, always talk about transparency, reconciliation, consistency, and investor protection. How do you support pricing discussions between bankers and management? Sample answer. I analyze valuation benchmarks, demand signals from QIBs, market sentiment, and scenario-based pricing outcomes. While answering, always talk about benchmarks, demand signals, negotiation logic, and valuation discipline. How do you evaluate sensitivity of valuation to changes in key assumptions? Sample answer. I run sensitivities on revenue growth, margins, capex, WACC, and market multiples to show valuation volatility. While answering, always talk about key drivers, sensitivity modeling, risk view, and investor implications. A company has multiple subsidiaries. How do you prepare consolidated disclosures? Sample answer. I harmonize accounting policies, align reporting dates, consolidate segment information, and ensure clean intercompany eliminations. While answering, always talk about policy alignment, consolidation accuracy, segment clarity, and investor usability. End. How do you review risk management framework to ensure IPO readiness? Sample answer. I assess enterprise risks, control maturity, governance reporting, and internal audit effectiveness. Investors expect a robust risk backbone. While answering, always talk about risk identification, control maturity, governance, and disclosure quality. A business has complex revenue models. How do you simplify disclosures for investors? Sample answer. I disaggregate revenue logically by product, geography, customer type, and present cost drivers and key KPIs in simple language. While answering, always talk about clarity, disaggregation, key drivers, and investor comprehension. How do you assist in drafting MD&A for the prospectus? Sample answer. I link financial results with operational drivers, provide trend explanations, highlight risks, and articulate forward-looking elements conservatively. While answering, always talk about clarity, linkage to drivers, balanced disclosure, and consistency. A company faces cyber risks. How do you determine disclosure materiality in the DRHP? Sample answer. I assess likelihood, past incidents, control strength, and potential financial/operational impact. Material risks must be disclosed explicitly. While answering, always talk about impact, likelihood, control strength, and investor expectations. How do you analyze investor roadshow feedback and refine messaging? Sample answer. I categorize feedback, valuation concerns, competitive risks, governance queries, and adjust narrative while staying consistent with disclosures. While answering, always talk about feedback themes, narrative adjustments, investor priorities, and disclosure boundaries. A company makes last-minute changes to financial projections. How do you advise on implications? Sample answer. I review rationale, validate assumptions, assess valuation impact, and ensure consistency with DRHP disclosures. Sudden shifts can erode investor trust. While answering, always talk about rationale, validation, valuation impact, and credibility. How do you prepare management for due diligence interviews with bankers and legal teams? Sample answer. I conduct mock interviews, prepare talking points, ensure factual alignment with disclosures, and train them to avoid speculative statements. While answering, always talk about preparation, message discipline, disclosure compliance, and confidence. After the IPO, how do you support the company with continuing listing obligations? Sample answer. I help set up periodic reporting cycles, insider trading controls, board committees, investor communications, and compliance monitoring. While answering, always talk about reporting cadence, governance, compliance, and market communication. Thank you for watching, and if you liked our video, kindly press the like button and leave us a comment. This will help us reach a wider audience. Don't forget to check the playlist for more great learning.